he is the one who set up the government in Iran at that point. And he's the one, if it so happens, will put in somebody else there. None of that takes God by surprise. So what do we have to fear in all of that? We should try to guard and keep our hearts to where we are more focused on God rather than being focused on what's taking place in the Middle East. We should also live faithfully where we are. You know, whether we realize it or not, we can't control geopolitics. We can't control what different leaders around the world do and do not do. But you know what we can control? We can control our obedience to God and our obedience to Him. Welcome back to the Sunday to Society podcast. I'm your host, Riley, where we help you go from the pews to the public square. We release new episodes every Monday on your favorite podcasting apps, such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever else you're listening to audio podcast. You can listen to the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or hit that follow button if you're listening to the audio version. We're going to talk today about the current crisis and war in the Middle East. And by the time this has come out, things may have been developed more over the next several days from the time of recording to the time of publication of this episode. But here's why this crisis in the Middle East is feeling a little different than past other ones. And it's really the escalation that has kind of led up to it. There's a lot of different things that have come before where we are currently in the Middle East. If you've paid attention to the news over the last several, not only months, but even into the last several years, of all of the different conflicts that Israel has found themselves in with neighboring groups or countries. And this isn't really anything new, obviously. Things have been going on in that part of the world really ever since biblical times and even before then, and will continue on until Jesus comes back. But with all of the different conflicts that have been going on, all of the different involvements from the United States, there's really been this global anxiety of what is going to happen during this conflict that's been taking place. And that's kind of the escalation. All of these things have been building up for really years now. And we've seen this begin to take place and been able to view it from several months or even years out with talks of nuclear weapons and enriching uranium and different things like that. And here's why sometimes it might feel personal, especially based off of the places around the Middle East where these things are taking place, because it might not only affect our news cycle, but it might also begin to affect us personally. And here's what I mean by that. Because of the conflict that is taking place in Iran and their large oil production, we might see our own gas prices here in the United States continue to rise. And that might be different amounts for different places around the country. And then furthermore, the stock markets might begin to fluctuate, big dips and big rises and different things like that. And sometimes even travel might be disrupted because of the influx of flights coming to and out of the Middle East, or even certain places upping security measures during this time. Although the initial conflict is taking place thousands and thousands of miles away, it also affects us here in the United States, but it's not going to affect just the United States. It's also going to affect many other countries around the world. And as we're on social media, there might have these fears of different things that are taking place in the Middle East. So I want us to kind of unpack a little bit of this today and how we as Christians should respond to the things that are taking place in the Middle East. And the first one is this. There's a lot of emotional reactions to these types of things. And when we read of them on the news, we might have all kinds of different emotions that are running through our mind on what is taking place in the Middle East. The first emotion that we might experience is that of fear. Because we might ask ourselves this question: are we on the brink of something much, much bigger Is there going to be a third world war that is taking place here? Do I have to live in fear of people coming and dropping bombs here in the United States? And all of these different thoughts might initially appear in our mind, and we think about them and meditate upon them, but yet we forget that in Psalm 46, verse 1, Christ says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Elsewhere in Scripture, it says, God had not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And when we have these thoughts of fear, what are some of the thoughts that might take place in your mind? Now, can I say this? That none of this has taken God by surprise. In fact, God knew that all of these different things were going to take place long before you and I ever came into the picture, long before any of the current world powers ever came to power. God knew that all of this was going to happen. It didn't surprise him. And yet, God still has a plan in all of this. Remember, God is the one who sets up kings and brings kings down. He is the one who set up the government in Iran at that point. And he's the one, if it so happens, will put in somebody else there. None of that takes God by surprise. So, what do we have to fear in all of that? Another emotion we might have is that of speculation. Especially my social media feed here over the last several days has been so inundated, so flooded with all kinds of different end time charts and people posting prophetic verses and all of these important cautions regarding end times and all of this. And especially at the time of recording last night, we had this blood moon where the moon had turned red for a little while and all of these different things. And people might get so inundated on these different speculations of all of these different things. But let me tell you this. Conflict in the Middle East is nothing new. All of this is things that have been going on for hundreds and thousands of years. But rather than, speculating what's going to happen next, and again, by this time this episode's recorded to the time of release, things might have changed drastically or things might have changed very little. But Scripture calls us to be watchful, doesn't it? It doesn't call for mass hysteria, mass fear. It calls for us to be watchful. It says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Don't look at the news and then social media and then speculate on what's going to happen next. Let's be honest. We have no idea what's going to happen next. We have no clue. But you know who does? God knows exactly what's going to happen. And he's the one who's going to set up kings and tear kings down. So Scripture does call us to be watchful for these things. Another emotion that we might experience while we are reading the news is anger and polarization, because Christians might be divided politically. There will be, if there's not already, all kinds of different online outrages. And yes, Israel and America were right in doing this. And then you might have other Christians say no, that Israel and America didn't have the right to do it, and so on and so forth. And when we think about all this different anger, it further pushes a wedge in between Christians and between those who aren't Christians. And there's all this anger on was it right or was it wrong, and that's not what we're here to talk about today in this episode. But really, whether it be actual war or war online or whatever it might be, war exposes what's already in our heart. And I spoke last week in my church about how out of the mouth reveals the things that are already in our heart. And thinking about war, here's what war reveals about humanity. And thinking of all of these different conflicts that have taken place in the Middle East and other parts around the world, it reveals a couple of different things. It reveals to us, and should remind us rather, that the world is still fallen, that we live in an imperfect world filled with a bunch of imperfect people. And it reminds us that in Romans 3:23 it says, for all have sinned. It reminds us that we live in an imperfect world, don't we? That wars are going to happen, that conflicts are going to happen, and that we live in an imperfect world. And these conflicts, reflect individual sin, don't they? Pride, power, revenge, fear. And think about this, it could be national pride. Not that that is necessarily a bad thing, but when it becomes a spot to where it becomes sin, I think then we've missed the point, and it becomes this power. We try to get on this level of godlike power, a level of power that should only be reserved for God and God Himself. And then there might be this idea of revenge, that I am going to seek revenge over those who have done me wrong. I'm going to try to get a leg up on what this person has done to me, and I'm going to get revenge on them. And we see a lot of that today, don't we? Especially in these different conflicts. And there's this, as we've already talked about, this idea of fear of what's going to happen next, and that there's fear into the world because we have no idea what is going to take place each and every single day. Yet, as we look at these wars, and you'll see these different technologies such as drones and missiles and intelligent networks and AI and all of these different things. I read an article just the other day of how electronic warfare has already taken place in the Middle East by shutting down different infrastructures, both military and civilian, and how all of these technologies, many of them didn't even exist just 10 or 15 years ago, but now we are using them to disrupt different things. But as we think about how technology has advanced, we can be reminded that the human heart has not advanced at all. Because think about this, the things that people have struggled with in the Bible are things that you and I still struggle with today. Things such as hatred. Think about all of the different people in the Bible who dealt with anger and hatred. Now, you think of people groups in the world that don't like each other, you're probably thinking of people who live in the Middle East. And there's a lot of countries in that part of the world that have a great hatred one for another, and that stems all the way back to biblical times. And it promotes tribalism, that our country is better than your country, therefore we are going to try to wipe your country off the face of the map. And that further leads to violence. And you've probably yourself have seen some of the video clips of bombs being dropped in different parts around the Middle East. And all of this is leading us and reminding us to the fact that although technology has advanced through warfare, our human heart has not. That's why there's still wars, because we do live in this imperfect world. And that wars have been going on for a long, long time. You know, wars, although they have maybe changed of how they're fought, we read of wars all the way back in the Old Testament of the Bible. We read of wars all throughout Scripture. Wars aren't something new. Instead, they are very, very, very old. And I do want us to look here over the next several minutes on a biblical look, a biblical lens, so to speak, of what God says about war. And the Scripture does very much address this, doesn't it? God does address wars. In fact, many times He would tell His people to go into the promised land and through wars purge the land of the people who were living in there. And the Bible just, it doesn't ignore that wars don't exist. It, in fact, very much does. And especially in the New Testament, you read of conflicts of this kingdom against that kingdom. And in fact, many times God would use wars to punish His people because they went to search after other gods and goddesses. But on the flip side, God would also instruct His people to go to war to further take back the promised land that God had given them. And whether or not they chose to obey God and all of that, whether or not they chose to follow God's commands and all of that, kind of reveals God's sovereignty, that He is in control of this entire world. Now, let me give you an example. Remember when the nation of Israel, they have come out of Egypt, they have now crossed into the promised land after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And Joshua is now in charge, and God has instructed the nation of Israel to march around the city of Jericho one time for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, march around the city 7 times, And at the end of that, they were to blow their trumpets, and then the walls of Jericho would come crumbling down. And they were also instructed not to take anything from the people of Jericho. Now, we know that somebody named Achan did. And when Achan took, he tried to cover it up. Now, the city of Jericho was a big walled city. And so, in fact, when they are finished with Jericho and now they're going to a small place of Ai, somewhere where they didn't even send their entire army because they figured that it wouldn't be much of a battle at all. However, because of the sin of Achan, there were people who lost their lives, and Israel lost that initial battle of Ai, all stemming back because they didn't obey God's command like they were supposed to. This shows us that God very much is in control of battles and wars. And as I said a moment ago, that in Psalm 103, verse 19, the Lord hath prepared his throne in heaven, and his kingdom ruleth over all. And regardless of what's taking place in the Middle East, just know that God's kingdom is bigger and greater, more powerful, and it is the kingdom that ruleth over all. But, thinking about war, God does teach peacemaking, doesn't he? In Matthew 5, verse 9, in the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount, Christ says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." As Christians, we're not to be fueled by revenge or to bring out vengeance against people. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't just be ignoring evil when it's taking place, but God has called us to be peacemakers as well. Now, I don't know how familiar you might be with the Quakers. And when you think of Quakers, you might think of the 16 and 1700s of people coming to America to settle colonies. And one of the Quakers that I think of, that's probably one of the most famous, is William Penn. And the Quakers are most well known for being people who are against war. They would be neutral when it comes to the American Revolution. And they thought that we should be peacemakers, and we should. But this doesn't just mean ignoring evil. And thinking about what God thinks about war, in Psalm 122, verse 6, it says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." Now, when is the last time that we have even prayed for the peace of Jerusalem? Think about when the last time Jerusalem even had peace. Yet we're still commanded to pray for it. And we should pray that God would give the leaders wisdom. We should pray that God would guide them in the many, many different decisions that they will have to make over the next couple of days, months, maybe even years. So we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And this is just a very brief overview on different things that God says about war in the Bible. We should also, when we're thinking about this conflict and how should we respond to it, we should avoid these two dangerous extremes. And the first one, and we've already discussed it a little bit, but extreme number one is this: obsessive speculation. And as I've already alluded to, my social media feed, at least, and maybe yours is too, is filled with all kinds of different end time speculations and all of these different things. Some people, the temptation might even be to obsess about all of these different things. And they might run to scripture and quote Revelation or quote the book of Daniel and say God is returning really soon and all of these different things. But is that what we are commanded to do? Christ says in Matthew 24, verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man." We should be watchful, waiting for Jesus to come and watching for him to come. But we should not be reckless, such as setting dates. Christ very much warns against that. Because sometimes the extreme expectation, extreme speculation might be this: oh, after every missile strike, this is it. Christ is coming back tomorrow, and that's the far, far extreme. Although sometimes the temptation might be for people to take it that far. And we should be watchful, don't get me wrong, but we should not be reckless. The other extreme, it might be this, going from obsessive speculation to complete indifference. And somebody might say, well, this conflict, it's taking place in the Middle East. That's on the other side of the world, so it really doesn't affect me all that much. Well, as we've already alluded to and already looked at just a little bit, it actually does affect you more than you might imagine. As we've said, war involves families and children and different things like that. And for us, it might affect our daily lives here in just a little bit with gas prices and travel disruptions and different things like that. But, if we have a complete indifference, I think we might be missing the point a little bit. Yes, believers are called to be compassionate, aren't they? And have already looked at, we are to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Christians, we shouldn't celebrate suffering of people, should we? In fact, I've seen where Christians have celebrated the death of some political leader around the world that they don't like. Does God ever command us to do that? Not at all. He's the one, of course, who allowed those things to take place, but we shouldn't ever celebrate suffering of people that we don't necessarily agree with. So, as we begin to get a little more practical, as we look at how should we even respond to this and what should the church do, we as a church and as Christians should pray intentionally. Of course, we should pray for the peace of Israel. We should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We should pray for these different things. We should pray for the leaders, as I've already mentioned, to act wisely, for God to give them wisdom. Whenever we have prayer requests on a Wednesday night at church, one of the things that I always pray for is that God would give our president and other leaders involved in this conflict wisdom as they make different decisions. Now, although sometimes it might seem like some leaders might make decisions like this at the drop of a hat, I would venture to say that that's probably not the case. That they probably think about these decisions long and hard before actually ever enacting on them. And we as Christians especially should pray that God would give these leaders wisdom during these times. But we should also pray for believers in the region. Pray for those who are followers of Christ, that God would give them safety as they are maybe sheltered in place in these different countries in that part of the world. So we should pray intentionally, but we should also guard our hearts. And it's very, very tempting to allow the news to shape us, to allow social media to shape us, rather than looking at what God has said in his word and what God has said about kingdoms and kings. And Solomon writes in Proverbs 4, verse 23, to keep thy heart with all diligence. Something easier said than done, isn't it? We should try to guard and keep our hearts to where we are more focused on God rather than being focused on what's taking place in the Middle East. We should also live faithfully where we are. Whether we realize it or not, we can't control geopolitics. We can't control what different leaders around the world do and do not do. But you know what we can control? We can control our obedience to God and our obedience to Him. John 16, verse 33 says, in the world you shall have tribulations, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. We shouldn't be so surprised when wars come up and conflicts come up. We can't control that, but what we can control is, am I doing what God has given me to do here? Am I doing what He has commanded me to do where I am at? We can control that. We can't control what's going on around the world, but we can control what we are doing for Christ. So we should live faithfully. And here, as we begin to close down this episode, we can look at the eternal perspective And we've already alluded to this a little bit, but these different conflicts that take place around the world, it reminds us that number one, earthly kingdoms rise and fall. That God is the one who sets kings up and tears kings down. That earthly kingdoms rise and fall. You think about the different world powers throughout history. You think of Babylon and Assyria and Rome and people like Alexander the Great and people like that. Where are those kingdoms today? They don't even exist anymore, do they? But you know what kingdom still does exist? God's kingdom. Revelation 11 verse 15 says, "And he shall reign forever and ever." That when other kingdoms rise and fall, God's kingdom will never fall. In fact, God will sit on the throne forever and forever. And all war does is it just highlights instability in our world. In an imperfect world, there's all of this stability through war, yet God offers stability in his kingdom, doesn't he? As we close, here's some different questions that we might think about and look at as we think about what's taking place in the Middle East. Questions such as, has this conflict stirred fear in me? Am I tempted to see what's going on in the news and it drums up this fear? And if God says in his word, he has not given us the spirit of fear. So if it hasn't come from God, then where has it come from? It's coming maybe from Satan himself to drum up fear, to get us to live in fear so that we will be more distracted on that fear rather than allowing us to obey God. Another question to ask ourselves is this: am I consuming more news than I am scripture? Because that's the temptation. We want to be informed, and don't get me wrong, I'm all about being informed on what's taking place around the world. But sometimes the temptation might be to be more informed by never turning off the news than being informed on what Christ says in his word. Another question we should ask ourselves is this: am I praying as much as I am posting? Am I praying for these different things that we've already discussed in this episode than I am posting about it on social media? And furthermore, when I am responding to those posts, or I'm responding to the news, or I'm drawing conclusions, does that response reflect the character of Christ? And as we think about all that's taking place in the Middle East, and there is so much, again, by the time I record this to the time of publishing, lots may have happened. We don't know. But what we do know is that God still sits on the throne in heaven. That although the headlines might shake nations like they did just a few days ago, just knowing that God still sits on the throne, that he's the one who raises kings up and tears kings down. He's the one whose kingdom shall reign forever and ever. And therefore, we should be of good cheer because Christ himself has overcome the world. I hope I've given you some things to think about in this episode. If you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or hit that follow button if you're listening to the audio version on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else. You can like us on our Facebook page at Sunday to Society Podcast, and you can follow us on Instagram at Sunday to Society. I hope you have a great day, and God bless.